My name is Claire Weston, and for the past 8 years I was known as just the nanny. Not Claire, not Miss Weston, not even the woman who practically raised their children. Just the nanny. You'd be surprised how invisible you become when you wear the title. How quickly rich people forget you're a person, not part of the furniture. I was 23 when I started working for the Lennox family. Their home was a fortress of wealth, reputation and secrets. They paid well, smiled in public, and rotted behind closed doors. I wasn't hired to ask questions. I was hired to change diapers, prepare lunches, pick up dry cleaning, and disappear into the background. And that's exactly what I did. Until I didn't. Because while they whispered, behind closed doors I listened. While they staged smiles for Instagram, I saw what happened after they logged out. While they fought, cheated, lied. I was there, feeding their kids, calming their tantrums, pretending I didn't hear, pretending I didn't see. But I saw everything. And when I got the invitation to Olivia's wedding, the eldest Lennox daughter, I knew it was time. Time to stop being the help and start. Being the voice they never thought I had. Because that day wasn't just her wedding, it was my reckoning. The wedding was set to be the event of the year. A garden ceremony at the Lennox estate, of course. Imported flowers, gold-rimmed champagne, flutes, a 6-tiered cake flown in from Paris, and me standing quietly at the edge of it all, dressed in navy blue, not black. I didn't want to be mistaken for staff again. When the envelope arrived with Claire Weston elegantly printed in gold, I almost laughed. After everything, they still saw me as polite enough to invite. But not important enough to notice. They probably assumed I'd decline quietly. I never spoke up. I never caused trouble. I was the help. Harmless. But that's where they made their mistake. Because the version of Claire they remembered wasn't the one who RSVP'd. The Claire who arrived that day wasn't there to witness love. She was there to deliver truth, and I didn't need a microphone. I had something louder. Facts. I walked through the gate and watched as familiar faces turned. Aunt Margaret with her third husband, Uncle Theo already on his second martini. Even Olivia, the bride, looked up and gave me that same half smile, the one she wore when asking me to clean her messes. None of them knew what I carried in my bag. The folder, the letters, the screenshots, the confessions. They had no idea the storm that was about to hit them. In the most beautiful venue they ever booked, I kept my distance at first, let them soak in their illusions. Lennox family perfection on full display, flawless dresses, fake laughter, tight hugs with teeth clenched behind them. The photographer circled, the crowd like a hawk, capturing images for magazines that would never know the truth. I sipped my drink, listened to the whispers, heard she was just the nanny. Why is she even here? She always looked like she knew too much. They weren't wrong. By the time I left that house, I had journals filled with everything they thought no one noticed. Affairs, addictions, lies. Verbal abuse so casually spoken it felt like background noise. Children ignored while parents argued. Over renovations. Nannies like me trained to smile through the fire, and I did. For years. Until I found the notebook Olivia left on the counter one night. I was cleaning up after a dinner party. She was drunk, careless. Inside were entries, real ones, dark ones, about her fiancé, her mother, herself. She wrote like she wanted, to be found. So I found her, and what she wrote changed everything. I kept those entries hidden for years, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I wasn't ready to burn the house down. But that morning, as I got dressed for her wedding, I pulled them out again. Pages of confessions, lies, cries for help written in neat cursive. She wrote about her father's affair, the one no one dared to speak of, about how she found the receipts, the hidden phone, the woman. She wrote about her mother's pills, about how the wine glasses were never full for long. She wrote about her fiancé, the yelling, the bruises she hid under makeup, how she knew she was marrying a man who would control her, because that's what women in this family do. They smile and walk down the aisle, no matter the truth. and she ended that final entry with, "If anyone ever finds this, I hope they do something braver than I ever could." I read that line 10 times before I zipped up my dress, because if she couldn't do it, I would. For her, for the children, for myself. And so I walked into that wedding like a soldier in satin, not to ruin it, but to rewrite it. The ceremony began right on time. Soft music, rows of guests. Olivia walked down the aisle in a gown that glittered like a secret. Her father escorted her, smiling like he wasn't the man who once screamed at her for getting a B in calculus. The guests sighed, took photos, pretended they were witnessing a fairy tale. I stood in the back, clutching the folder tighter than my purse. I hadn't planned the exact moment, only that I wouldn't leave without saying what needed to be said. Then, the officiant asked, "If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined?" And I stepped forward. The sound of my heels on stone echoed like thunder. Heads turned, gasps followed. I looked at Olivia. She didn't flinch. She knew. And that was all I needed. "I do," I said, not loudly, but clearly. And the silence that followed was louder than any scream I'd ever heard in that house. The officiant blinked, confused. Guests shifted in their seats, some chuckling nervously, others already scandalized. But I didn't waver. I walked down the aisle, slow, deliberate, past. A sea of familiar faces that had never once looked at me as more than background. I reached the front and turned, not to the bride or groom, but to the crowd. "My name is Claire Weston," I said. "Some of you know me as the Nanny." A few guests exchanged glances. Some whispered. I continued. "I was in this house for 8 years. I wiped noses, held crying, children, bandaged skinned knees, and kept my mouth shut. But today," I said, holding up the folder, "I'm not here to stay silent." Aunt Margaret gasped. Uncle Theo dropped his glass. "I have in my hand the truth this family spent years covering in marble countertops and press releases. The truth about affairs, addictions, and abuse. The truth Olivia was brave enough to write, but not brave enough to speak." I turned to the bride. She didn't cry. She just nodded, barely. And that was all the permission I needed. So I opened the folder, and I began to read, word for word, page by page, as the perfect wedding cracked like glass under the weight of honesty. The first few lines were soft, about childhood, loneliness, the pressure to be perfect. Then it got darker. "I once watched my mother throw a crystal vase at my father's head," I read. "She said it was because he forgot their anniversary. But I knew it was the woman." People were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Lennox stood up, pale as bone. "Claire, that's enough," she said, trying to keep her voice even. But I ignored her. She drank 3 bottles that night. I cleaned up the glass. The blood. The silence. I moved on. To Olivia's fear. To the bruises she covered with makeup. To the screaming behind closed doors that was written off as stress. I watched as the groom's smile faded. As his parents squirmed. I turned one more page. She told me if I ever saw him raise his voice to her again, I should run. Not for her. For the children we'd have. The crowd was stunned. No one moved. No one dared. I could feel the weight of their judgment shifting. From me. To themselves. For all the times they saw and said nothing. For all the times they heard and looked away. For all the silence. I was breaking it now. At that point, someone tried to stop me. Mr. Lennox stood, his voice trembling with rage. "She's lying," he barked. "This is ridiculous." But his words were weak, because deep down, they all knew. The whispers, the bruises, the way Olivia stopped laughing after she got engaged. I turned to him slowly. "I'm not lying. Your daughter wrote this, in her own hand." I held up a page, visible for the front row. Signatures, dates, her handwriting. He went quiet, sat back down, and the silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Olivia again. She was holding her bouquet, like it might shatter. Her fiancé was staring at the ground, jaw clenched. He hadn't moved once, and that said everything. I closed the folder, looked out at the guests. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," I said. "I came here because someone needed to tell the truth. Because everyone else was too scared. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there, finally seen. And they couldn't unsee me now. No one clapped. No one cheered. But for the first time in my life, no one dismissed me either." Olivia stepped forward. Her hands shook as she handed the bouquet to her maid of honour. She took the mic from the officiant. I knew someone had to say, "It," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. "Thank you, Claire." Then she turned to her fiancé. "This wedding is over." Gasps filled the air. His face turned red, his jaw clenched tighter. He muttered something under his breath, but she didn't flinch. She walked off the stage, not crying, not hysterical, just done. I followed her inside. Guests murmured, unsure if they should leave or wait for cake. The Lennox family stood frozen, their empire of control crumbling in front of them. And I didn't feel like the nanny anymore. I felt like the match that finally lit the fire. Not to destroy, but to reveal the smoke they'd all been choking on for years. And finally, they were breathing it in. Inside the mansion, everything felt still. No more string quartet, no more fake laughter echoing off marble floors, just footsteps, mine and Olivia's. We walked through the halls we both knew too well, me as an outsider, her as a prisoner. She stopped by the staircase, pulled off her heels and leaned against the banister. "I thought I could go through with it," she whispered. "But you didn't," I said gently. She looked at me, eyes red but clear. "No, because you didn't let me." That hit me harder than anything else that day, because for so long I believed I had no power, that my voice didn't matter. But there she was, the golden daughter of the Lennox family, finally breaking free. Because I spoke. "Are you okay?" I asked. She laughed, short, bitter. "No, but I think I will be." I nodded. "That's a start." She reached out, and for the first time in 8 years she hugged me, not as a servant, not as the help, but as someone who saw her, and said something. And in that moment, we weren't bride and nanny, we were just two women, finally done being quiet. Eventually, guests started to leave, some in silence, some muttering excuses. A few still took selfies in the floral archway, because appearances always die last. The Lennox parents tried to regain control. Mrs. Lennox blamed stress and wedding jitters. Mr. Lennox said it was a misunderstanding, but no one believed them anymore. They'd been exposed, not by scandal, but by truth, raw, unfiltered, the kind that doesn't make headlines but settles deep in people's bones. I stood by the window and watched it all unravel. The photographer quietly packed up his gear. The servers whispered in Spanish, not knowing. I understood every word. They were proud of me. I smiled at that, because for once, I wasn't a ghost in the room. I was the reason the room shifted, and it wasn't revenge I felt, it was release. Olivia didn't say much after. She just handed me an envelope. Inside was a note, written in the same handwriting I had memorised from her journal. 3 words. "You saved me." And just like that, all the years I spent invisible meant something. I stayed at the estate that night. Not because I wanted to, but because Olivia asked me to. "Just for tonight," she said. "I don't want to be alone." So we sat in her childhood room, sipping wine from paper cups. She in her silk robe, me in my wrinkled dress. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about the fallout. We talked about the kids, about the time little. Henry ate glue and we had to call poison control. About the night the power went out and I turned the living room into a camping tent with flashlights. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from her in years. And I realised something. She hadn't needed a nanny. She had needed an ally, someone to see her truth and not flinch, someone who didn't want her polished version, just the real one. That night, we both slept easier. Not because the world was fixed, but because we weren't pretending anymore. The next morning, I packed my bag. She hugged me at the door. This time, longer. This time, real, and whispered, "Thank you for showing up." The drive home was quiet. No music, just the sound of tyres on pavement and my own heartbeat. I kept thinking about the silence that followed my speech. It wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Like a space had finally opened for truth to breathe. For 8 years, I blended into their world. I watched them decorate dysfunction with polished furniture and fake traditions. And for 8 years, I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But here's the thing. Sometimes silence is complicity, and I had been complicit, not because I agreed, but because I was afraid. Afraid of being fired, afraid of being called dramatic, afraid of being labelled just the nanny. But not anymore. That title, the one they used to diminish me, became my armour. I had been there for everything, and now that experience gave me the power to break the cycle. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was rising, and it felt like something more than a new day. It felt like a new version of me, one who wasn't afraid to speak, to be seen, to write the ending that no one else had the courage to write. Days passed, then weeks, and the calls started, some from other nannies, some from guests who were there, some anonymous. Each one started the same way. I just wanted to say, and ended with, "Thank you for saying it." Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had been watching. Lennox family had a long history of silence, but once one person broke it, others followed. I didn't do interviews. I didn't go viral. This wasn't about fame. It was about freedom. A few mothers I once worked with called, asking if I'd come back. They said their kids missed me. But I said no, because I wasn't just a caretaker anymore. I was a storyteller, a truth teller, and I wanted to help others write their own versions of freedom. So I started something new, a blog, a podcast, a small circle where people could speak without fear, and it grew faster than I expected. Turns out there are a lot of people like me, just waiting for permission to stop being quiet. One night I got a message I didn't expect. It was from Olivia. She had moved out of the estate, cut ties with the groom's family, and started therapy. She wrote, "I'm still scared, but at least now I know what fear is and what it isn't." Then she added, "I want to help too. If you ever need a voice, I'm here." I stared at the screen for a long time, because it proved something I'd always believed. When one person stands up, it gives others permission to rise. I invited her to join one of the podcast episodes. She said yes, and we told the story. Together. Not just of that day, but of everything that came before it and after. The feedback was overwhelming. People didn't just listen, they related, they cried, they finally felt seen. And that's when I realised I was never just the nanny. I was the one who listened, who remembered, and who finally spoke. And that made all the difference. After that episode aired, my inbox flooded. Messages from women in uniforms, teachers, housekeepers, nurses, assistants, all saying the same thing. I've lived this too. Some shared stories of silence that stretched decades. Some wrote with anger, others with relief. But every message had one thing in common. They had been overlooked, dismissed, called too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional. Just like me. And yet they carried families, institutions, whole lives on their shoulders. Invisible pillars no one ever thanked, until someone finally said, "I see you." That someone, somehow, was me. And all it took was one moment, one story, one truth said out loud. I kept creating. Writing stories based on real messages, anonymously, respectfully. And every time I hit publish, someone else found the courage to speak. It became a ripple, a chain reaction of honesty, not to destroy families, but to rebuild them on something real. Not image, not silence, but truth. Because only truth can survive the storm of shame, and once spoken, It cannot be unspoken. Months later, I got another letter. This one was handwritten. The envelope was elegant, familiar. Inside was a card from Mrs. Lennox. It said, "You were never invisible. We just refused to look. I'm sorry." No signature, just her initials. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was a crack in the wall, proof that even the proudest masks can slip. And part of me felt peace. Not because I needed her to apologise, but because she finally acknowledged the damage. Sometimes closure doesn't come with an embrace. It comes in a few small words scratched onto paper. I kept that note, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That silence can break, even from the most polished lips. I still don't know what happened to her marriage, to the facade. But I do know this. I won't ever be in that house again. Not as the help, not as the secret keeper, not as the shadow. Because now, I write the stories, and I don't wait for permission to speak. I was invited to another wedding a few months later, not as a nanny, not as a guest out of pity, but as a speaker. The bride had heard my podcast. She said, "Your voice made me walk away from the man I almost married." Now she was marrying someone new, someone who respected her silence and her voice. She asked me to write something, not a poem, not a speech, just something real. So I did. And as I stood in front of a smaller crowd, under soft string lights and real laughter, I read the words that changed me. Not Olivia's words. Mine, about truth, about seeing each other beyond roles, titles, appearances, about how one voice, even trembling, can wake a room full of people who pretend to sleep. When I finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was full of meaning, full of recognition. And afterward, an old woman approached me. She placed a hand on mine and said, "You reminded me of who I used to be, before they told me to be quiet." That moment stayed with me longer than any standing ovation, because that's what storytelling is, not performance, but permission to feel, to remember, to rise. I think about the Lennox kids sometimes, the ones I used to read bedtime stories to. I wonder if they remember me, if they ask where I went, if they'll grow up and realise the difference between pretending and protecting. I hope they do, because they deserve more than silence dressed as love. They deserve to know the truth, not just the version framed on holiday cards. Maybe one day they'll read what I wrote. Maybe they'll hear the recordings. Maybe they'll understand why I did what I did. Not to embarrass their family, but to show them that love isn't something you lie to protect. It's something you live in honesty. Even if it's messy, especially when it's messy, I used to wonder if I made the right choice, if I should have stayed quiet to keep the peace. But peace built on fear isn't peace, it's pressure, and pressure breaks. Now, I live a quieter life. But not a silent one, and that's the difference. Because now, when I speak, people listen. Not because I shout, but because I say what others are still afraid to. So here I am, Claire Weston. Former nanny, now a writer, a speaker, a woman who finally knows her worth. Not because someone handed it to me, but because I claimed it. I wasn't born loud. I wasn't raised to confront. But I learned that silence is a language, and I was fluent for too long. The day I stood at that wedding wasn't just a turning point for Olivia. It was a rebirth for me. I stopped waiting to be invited to the table. I brought my own chair, and when they asked who gave me the right to speak, I said, I did. Because I saw everything, because I remembered, because I mattered, and so do you. If you're reading this, listening to this, watching this, know that your truth has weight, even if they don't believe you, even if they pretend not to see you, even if they call you just the nanny. One day they'll hear you, and when they do, don't whisper, speak. Because your silence was never their victory, your voice is.